Some tragedies are never truly forgotten. They live on in the memories of those left behind, and sometimes in the most unexpected places. Millions of people around the world have heard the haunting melody of An Innocent Warrior, a song from Disney's Moana. Few realise it was inspired by a real tragedy. Long before it found its way onto cinema screens, it had become a symbol of remembrance for the people of one of the world's smallest nations. A reminder of a night that left an entire country grieving, and raised painful questions about the trust parents place in those responsible for their children's care. Every day, millions of parents do exactly that, believing their children will be safe until it's time to come home. In the tiny Pacific nation of Tuvalu, that trust meant saying goodbye as their children travelled to the country's largest boarding school. On the evening of the 9th of March 2000, 36 teenage girls settled down for another ordinary night in their dormitory. By the following morning, 18 of them would never leave, and the loss would touch almost every community across Tuvalu. At the turn of the new millennium, Tuvalu was one of the smallest and most isolated nations on Earth. Scattered across 9 low-lying coral atolls in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, its entire population numbered only around 10,000 people. In a country that small, very few people were strangers. Families were closely connected, and news rarely took long to spread from one island to the next. Education was deeply valued, and Motufoua Secondary School represented the best opportunity for many young Tuvaluans to build a future beyond their home islands. Students travelled from across the country, leaving parents, brothers and sisters behind, sometimes for months at a time, to live and study on Vaitupu. Life at the boarding school was structured and disciplined. Every day was filled with lessons, chores and study before evenings settled into a familiar routine. By 10 o'clock, lights out had been called. Dormitories fell quiet. The day's conversations faded into whispers, and another school day came to an end. The girls' dormitory was a simple wooden building that had stood for many years. Inside, rows of beds stretched the length of the dormitory, separated only by narrow walkways between simple wooden furniture. Like many boarding schools, rules existed to maintain order. Once the girls were inside for the night, the dormitory doors were locked to prevent boys from entering. The windows were covered with wire mesh. They were ordinary precautions, accepted without question by students, staff and parents alike. No one imagined those same measures could one day become part of a disaster from which there would be almost no escape. During March, tests were approaching, and many of the girls were eager to fit in one last round of revision before bed. Doing well at Motufoua offered opportunities that simply didn't exist back home. But studying after lights out presented a problem. Electricity at the school was limited, and once the dormitory was supposed to be asleep, lights were expected to remain off. Yet the pressure to succeed often persuaded some students to continue studying in secret. That evening, one of the girls decided she needed just a little more time. Trying not to attract attention, she lit a small candle and placed it inside a cardboard box, covering it with a sheet to conceal its glow from the dormitory matron. It was a simple attempt to break the rules without being caught, and according to later investigations, it was not an unusual practice. Around her, the dormitory gradually fell silent. Some girls were already asleep. Others whispered to friends before eventually drifting off. Outside, the tropical night settled over Vaitupu. Apart from the occasional sound of insects, the school had grown quiet. Then, shortly after 11 o'clock, something went terribly wrong. Whether the candle was knocked over, or the flame caught the sheet covering the box has never been established with certainty. What is known is that the bedding caught alight. Within moments, the fire was beginning to spread through the dormitory. At first there were only shouts of alarm. Then came the screams. The cries jolted the dormitory awake as girls sat upright in their beds, confused by the shouting and the growing smell of smoke. In the darkness, it was difficult to understand what was happening, until someone saw the flames. Panic spread through the room. As smoke rolled across the ceiling, the girls scrambled from their beds, calling out to one another while instinctively making for the nearest door. But it wouldn't open. Again and again they pulled desperately at the handle, only to realize it had been locked for the night. Outside, the commotion had already roused staff and students from neighbouring buildings. The dormitory matron ran towards the blaze as terrified voices cried out from inside. As the flames spread through the timber walls, burning fragments began falling from the ceiling, filling the dormitory with choking smoke. Still, she tried to reach the girls trapped within. She would lose her life trying to save them. Every breath became a struggle. Smoke filled the room, visibility all but disappeared, and the girls found themselves trapped in a darkness that was growing hotter, thicker, and more suffocating with every passing second. Then, amid the chaos, someone spotted another way out. Several of the girls fought their way towards a second door, but it refused to budge. Two of them threw themselves against it with everything they had. Once, twice, and then again. Finally, the wood splintered and the door burst open. Girls stumbled out into the night, coughing, crying, and gasping for air, as those outside rushed to pull them clear of the burning building. By now, the fire was beyond anyone's control. The old wooden dormitory had become a furnace. Flames tore through the roof as burning embers drifted high into the night sky, casting an orange glow across the school and beyond. Students, teachers, and local residents rushed towards the blaze, but there was little they could do. Vaitupu had no modern fire brigade, and no specialist equipment capable of tackling a fire of this scale. Instead, buckets of water were passed from hand to hand in a desperate attempt to slow the flames. It was a hopeless task. For the families living nearby, the helplessness was almost unbearable. They could hear the screams coming from inside the dormitory and watch the flames consuming the building, yet there was almost nothing they could do except hope that more of the girls would somehow find a way out. As the fire finally began to burn itself out, the silence that followed was every bit as devastating as the chaos that had come before. The search of the ruins soon confirmed what many had already feared. 18 teenage girls had lost their lives. The dormitory matron, who had remained behind in a desperate attempt to save them, was also among the dead. As word spread across Tuvalu's scattered islands, hope slowly gave way to heartbreak. One family after another learned that someone they loved would never be coming home. In a nation of just 10,000 people, there were very few families who didn't know one of the 19. For hours, rescuers searched through the smoking remains of the dormitory, hoping against hope that someone else might still be alive. One by one, these hopes were extinguished as the scale of the disaster became painfully clear. As dawn broke over Vaitupu, there was no sense of a new day beginning. Instead, the island awoke to a silence that seemed to hang over every home, every classroom, and every shoreline. The news spread quickly across Tuvalu. Prime Minister Ionatana addressed the nation on Radio Tuvalu, confirming that the country had suffered one of the darkest days in its history. He travelled to Vaitupu to stand alongside grieving families as they faced an unimaginable loss. The practical realities were every bit as heartbreaking. Many of the victims had suffered such severe burns that they could no longer be identified with certainty. In the tropical heat and with only limited facilities available, officials made the painful decision to hold a mass funeral without delay. 19 coffins stood side by side. Parents who had entrusted the school with their daughters now gathered to say goodbye far sooner than anyone could ever have imagined. For a country with such a small population, this was not a tragedy affecting strangers. The girls had grown up together, attended church together, and belonged to families that were connected across the islands. Teachers mourned their students. Classmates mourned their friends. Entire villages shared the grief of parents whose futures had been changed forever. Long after the flames had been extinguished, the questions remained. How could a place of learning have become a place from which so many children could not escape? And could anything have been done to prevent it? In the days that followed, investigators began piecing together the sequence of events that had resulted in a national catastrophe. They found a series of decisions and circumstances that together had devastating consequences. The dormitory itself was an aging building made almost entirely out of wood. Most of the furniture was also wooden, including the beds and side cabinets. The bedding allowed the fire to spread with frightening speed, while the absence of smoke detectors and sprinkler systems gave those inside even less chance of escape. They believed that the fire had most likely begun with a candle which ignited nearby combustible materials. But while the fire may have started with a single flame, it was the conditions inside the dormitory that turned it into a disaster. Every night the doors were locked from the outside as part of the school's policy to prevent boys from entering the girls' dormitory, and the windows were covered with wire mesh. Measures intended to protect the girls had instead made escape desperately difficult. As smoke filled the building and visibility disappeared, those precious first moments were lost trying to reach exits that could not immediately be opened. In the aftermath, the policy forced painful questions about whether the tragedy could have been prevented. For the families who had buried their daughters, those questions could never change what had happened, but they might help ensure that no other parents would have to endure the same unimaginable loss. Although the fire had long since been extinguished, its impact would never truly fade. The people of Tuvalu refused to let the 19 who were lost become just another chapter in history. Outside Tuvalu, history has remembered them simply as 18 schoolgirls and their matron. Their individual names rarely appear in newspaper reports or history books, not because they have been forgotten, but because the nation came to remember them together. They became known simply as the 19. Years later, playwright Sonalofa Elisa, who lost a childhood friend in the fire, interviewed one of the survivors. She recalled the survivor saying, "It's something that should be spoken about. It helps us heal." Perhaps that is why in Tuvalu, the 19 have never been defined by the absence of their names. And so Tuvaluan musician Opoteye Foy wrote Loi Mata e Maligni, or Let the Tears Fall Down, to honour the 18 girls and their matron. It was a song born from grief, remembrance and love. Years later, that same melody would reach millions of people around the world, after being adapted into An Innocent Warrior for Disney's Moana. Most will never know the heartbreaking story that inspired it. Every time An Innocent Warrior is heard, most people hear a simple song. The people of Tuvalu hear something else. They hear daughters, classmates, friends, and the memory of 19 lives whose families trusted they would come home. Now, this was a terrible tragedy that touched almost everyone in such a small island community. Our condolences go out to the entire nation of Tuvalu for their loss. And despite the nature of the information, I hope you appreciated the way it was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.